Hello, and welcome to the LEAPcast, the podcast from the Leap Digital Health Hub. This is the very first episode of the LEAPcast, and we'll be talking to Dr. Paul Jewell, founder and CEO of Assuric, a platform that helps digital health companies meet safety and compliance standards, making sure that new technologies are not only innovative, but also trustworthy and ready for real-world use. He originally trained at Oxford and has over 8 years of clinical experience, alongside a strong track record in research, teaching, and publishing. He's also a certified clinical safety officer, which means he works to ensure that digital tools are safe for patients and clinicians alike. In this episode, we talk to Paul about UK regulation around software as a medical device, how developers should go about complying with regulation, and how those regulations might change in the future. You can find links to the various documents and guidance that Paul mentions in the podcast notes, along with a link to join the LEAP mailing list.
Hi, Karen. Thanks very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here and an honour to be here on the first of, I'm sure, many of the LEAP podcasts, which is great, the inaugural podcast. I'm a practicing doctor, so I practice based in South London in internal medicine, respiratory medicine as a registrar. I've been involved in digital health tech and AI for a long time. So I founded Assuric about 1.5 years ago with my co-founder Matt. And very briefly, this was kind of born out of both of our frustrations with the state of technology in healthcare, me as a doctor and Matt as service user of healthcare. Especially when you compare to other industries and sort of technology seems to really lag behind. And we really wanted to solve that. And we had lots of different ways of doing it. And we realized that digital health innovators and new technologies often struggled with this quite specific regulatory requirement when it comes to healthcare. And this can sometimes be a blocker or slow companies up. And it's been great because we work with tons of amazing innovators, health tech companies, AI companies deploying into the NHS, and we're building something that can ultimately try and accelerate the adoption of new technology, but of course making sure they're safe, secure, and effective in all the things that you would hope for newer technology in healthcare, when ultimately you want to protect patients and make sure everything works smoothly for sure.
Amazing. So you guys are really right at the intersection of sort of actual practicing medicine, but also innovation and presumably also policy, which is what we're going to talk about in a bit. But you're sort of right in it at the very cutting edge of it all.
Yeah. I mean, that's
amazing.
Why that's particularly exciting, because we work with amazing innovators and we really get to see how their products work and the kind of challenges they're navigating. But also we're building a product that kind of streamlines the process with regulations as they exist now, whilst also looking forward to see how they're changing, and they're going to constantly be evolving. But I mean, it's very exciting to kind of be at that cutting edge and to make sure we're a step ahead and being able to produce something that can have that impact that we want to see.
Amazing. So within Leap, we work with quite a few people who are developing AI-powered tools, in particular, tools that maybe use large language models. It's all very exciting stuff. But what we're talking about today is the sort of potential changes that are coming in next year that are looking to make more of that sort of software classified as a medical device. Can you tell me what that will mean? What does it mean to be a medical device versus just a piece of software sat on someone's computer?
Yeah, exactly. That's very exciting, and definitely the new technology that's coming out, the potential applications are very exciting. Of course, comes along with it some concerns around safety, which is why regulations need to kind of adapt and evolve, which is why we'll come on to some of these things. But I think there's 3 main areas to focus on. One, just going back to basics about what a medical device is, an approach you can take to work that out. And then 2, newer considerations. 1, where do LLMs fit into this, and what has been the recent guidance and sort of practical implications that LLMs use in the clinical settings, and we'll come on to that. And then also moves for the UK medical device regulation to align closely with the EU regulation, sort of timelines for that, and what that actually practically looks like in terms of software as a medical device, AI as a medical device, potential risk up classifications, and things like that. So those are the three main areas I think would be useful to focus on. So just focusing on the first, I think it's important for innovators, people building new technology in healthcare, just to go back to basics and work out if what they're building is a medical device.
Right, because to me, a medical device, when I hear the term medical device, it definitely sounds like some sort of mechanical, surgical implement. But that's certainly not really ever been the case, but it's definitely not the case anymore.
Completely. And often I take these things for granted because I've heard medical device used in the context of software so many times now, it sounds normal. But you're right, a medical device sounds like a physical hardware device. And this is because regulation and definitions predate software. So medical device regulations existed prior to any software as a medical device, the use cases of actual hardware. So surgical tools, hip replacements, all of these things. And of course, these need to be regulated and make sure they're safe. And then that law and those definitions have been extended to include software. Of course, we'll mainly talk about software as a medical device, but that's often why the regulations can seem a bit outdated or not fit the purpose when it comes to software. And we'll get into some of the nuances of that, but you're completely right. Medical device sounds like hardware.
Got it. Okay.
So I guess the important question is my technology, does it meet the definition of software as a medical device? And what you need to do to work that out is firstly work out what exactly you're building and define what's called your intended purpose. So this is really, how is the product intended to be used? What's the ultimate outcome? And included is, who is it supposed to be used by? Is it clinicians, patients, the general public? And what kind of group of people does it serve? Is it the general population? Is it specifically a group of people with a specific condition? And also, where is it being used? Is it in a hospital? Is it in, again, the general population? And defining all of these things help this important step to work out if what you're doing is a medical device or not. And often there's an art in crafting that intended purpose and intended use. And then once you've done that, you have to ask yourself, is this intended purpose a medical purpose? And importantly, if it's a medical purpose, then it's very likely to be meet the definition of software as a medical device. And I'll just read a definition from...
that'd be super useful.
I'll come on to a bit later about the differences between UK and the EU MDR, but broadly their definition of a medical device is similar, which is a medical device is defined as any instrument, so hardware, but software or other material intended to be used for human beings for purposes including diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of disease. So it's primarily software, a medical purpose is software that's being used for diagnosis, treatment, etc. And that's different to software, say, like your electronic health record systems, which aren't necessarily diagnosing, but they're being used in a clinical setting. And then, so you've got your intended purpose. You've asked yourself if it's a medical purpose. And I can come on to some more of the important considerations around population in the second. You also have to determine its functionality. So is it a low or a high functionality? And then a lot of what I'm drawing from is for people's own knowledge and references, quite recent guidance from the MHRA, specifically on digital mental health technologies. And that was published earlier this year. And so just to go into a few specific use cases to try and work out whether it's a medical purpose or not, because this is quite an important distinction. Firstly, so the population it's being used in, because I'm sure a lot of the people you work with, they might be building in the more of the wellness or well-being space, as opposed to maybe the kind of clinical space. And that's an important distinction, because if you're building a tool that maybe is used in the wellness space, so this is for the general population with what's called kind of subclinical symptoms.
Is that the kind of thing that I could just get off the App Store?
Exactly. So on the App Store, there's a huge number of apps that market themselves as kind of general mental health solutions or therapy solutions or maybe sleep solutions. And they're marketed the general population who generally have a normal or a subclinical variation in, say, mood or sleep and things like that. And it's often important about how you market the product.
Mm-hmm.
If you then say, actually, this product is for people with clinical depression and it will treat clinical depression or improve clinical grade insomnia, then you'll be entering into medical device territory because you're actually saying you're treating a clinically recognized condition. So to give some examples, Headspace, a very common app, is a kind of meditation and a general therapy app for the general population to improve normal variations of mood is not a medical device. Whereas quite a well-known one, Leapio, is a cognitive behavioral therapy tool for clinical grade insomnia, and is classified as a medical device because the kind of therapy it delivers is clinical grade and for a clinical condition. And then often there's a bit of strategy in terms of which group do you go for and what's your plan, or do you do a bit of both? And that's ultimately a kind of strategy decision.
Yes, so it's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
That will it will presumably have commercial implications as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's very important. We've mentioned the EU and UK MDR definitions of a medical device. I think this is a relatively new thing because it incorporates large language models, but the MHRA in their recent guidance, and this is really the only place it's been published earlier this year, they kind of extended that definition a bit to say if the tool is intended as part of a broad process involved in the management of mental ill health. So that kind of extends it not just from direct diagnosis and treatment, but part of the broad process. The reason I say that is because this applies to AI medical scribes, which is the main talking point of large language models and AI in healthcare and whether they're a medical device or not. So this kind of description generally considers them to be serving a medical purpose, when, as one would argue before, they were an administrative function and not serving a medical purpose.
So when you say a scribe, you literally mean, so if as a patient I have an appointment with my consultant, this tool will literally transcribe what we say to each other, and because there's maybe a level of interpretation there, that is now considered a medical device.
So I think this is an example worth focusing on because it's the main one that's kind of caused a lot of discussion and the changing guidance, and there's also variation between different countries on kind of how people view this. So it's an evolving area, but I'll try and break it down. So firstly, what is an AI scribe tool or an AI ambient scribe, also known as an AVT or ambient voice technology? So these are AI tools which would listen to a clinician-patient consultation. They would take the audio data and they would pass it into generally a generative AI model, a large language model, to then produce a summary of the consultation in your standard clinical documentation format. The important aspect is the majority aren't intended to be used to produce, say, diagnoses. They just summarize what was said. So if a diagnosis was said, they would put it in the note, but they wouldn't suggest diagnoses. So the feeling was before, this is not diagnosing or treating disease. It's more of a clinical administrative function. Therefore, technically, it may not meet the existing definition of a medical device.
Right. It's kind of like a fancy dictaphone almost.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, these definitions are in before this technology even existed. But I think quite rightly so, people are concerned because of the way these tools are used in a clinical setting, and that notes are saved into the record. This, as the MHRA extended definition suggests, is as part of that broad process of diagnosis or management. Therefore, probably should fall under the category of a medical device, which is why the MHRA probably added that bit to try and expand that definition a bit.
And is that unique to mental health?
So, well, that's the question. The only guidance that has come out has specifically said mental health, which is not particularly helpful. But that's the only kind of guidance the MHRA has put out. But since then, in April of this year, the NHS England has put out their own guidance. Now, NHS England is not a regulator, but they have put out guidance about the use of these scribe tools within the NHS. And they've said in that guidance that, again, it's not completely, they haven't worded it very well, but because they still talk about informing or driving clinical management. But they essentially have alluded to that these scribe tools if they use generative AI LLMs to do that summarization, as opposed to just directly write what was said, then that high level of functionality is likely to meet the medical definition of a medical device. So it practically, since that guidance, basically any AI scribe tool deployed in the NHS is expected to have at least a class 1 classification. So that's the kind of interpretation and implementation, really. So what that means for other LLM based kind of tools, we'll see. But I think the feeling now is that if you're using an LLM as this scribe function, then you're a class 1. Similarly to old definitions, if that tool produces or suggests a diagnosis, you would be a class 2A or above, because you're doing that diagnosis step. Firstly, we've kind of gone through this step of determining our intended purpose, determining whether that's a medical purpose in terms of how it's used, whether it's high or low functionality, the groups of people it's being used in. Say we have that ticked, yes, it's a medical purpose. Then we meet the definition of a medical device, software as a medical device. Then we have to determine our risk classification.
Right.
And risk classification is important because it determines what kind of evidence you need to produce, whether a third party auditor needs to certify you. And in both the UK and the EU, we have a risk classification going from class 1, the lowest risk, to 2A, 2B, and class 3, the highest risk. In both the UK and the EU, if you're a class 1 device, then you don't need an external assessment by an auditor or a regulator, which are called notified bodies in the EU and approved bodies in the UK. So what you have to do is a declaration of conformity, a self-declaration of conformity. So you're basically saying, we meet the requirements of class 1 medical device regulation, and no one checks that. But it does mean that once you're registered, then you're open to being audited by the likes of the MHRA. And an important distinction is that in the UK, quite a lot of software as medical device falls into a class 1 category, or claims they are a class 1. And then whereas in the EU, the majority of software as a medical device would be in class 2A or above. And that's important because if you have a class 2A or above, you have to be certified and assessed by this third party.
Right. So when you're developing your product and you're thinking about what claims you might want to make, are you kind of like, well, I want to be able to say my product does this, and does that then determine its intended purpose?
Yeah, I think because now we have this new technology, say large language models, generative AI, so many new use cases have popped up. And now there's lots of different ways you can kind of pitch it, like we said. So I think an understanding of that is important at an early stage. But there is a bit of an art to, say, crafting what your intended purpose is for your product, because you don't want to be so narrow that you can't kind of, obviously, as you know, software is quite agile and you're going to be making changes, and you want to be able to make improvements whilst aligning with your original intended use. If you're too narrow, then you can't necessarily make those changes and you have to certify a whole new product. So there's a bit of an art there, but you also can't be too broad so that they won't ever sort of certify you because it's too broad of a definition. So that's an important consideration for sure before coming to the differences between UK and EU. This is still a hugely evolving field, and the UK guidance that has come out, again, patchy, doesn't align with the rest of the world. Firstly, in the EU, many of these tools are being used without being certified as a medical device, and there hasn't really been much guidance that's come out. In Australia, recent guidance as early as August, so only last month, they specifically said that AI scribing tools, if they don't suggest a diagnosis and they just kind of summarize, then they're unlikely to be a medical device. So kind of a bit of the opposite of what the UK said.
So the UK sort of erring on more of the, like, this is a high risk situation.
Exactly. And then in the US, there's loads of AI scribe tools and other AI-based decision support tools that are being deployed, and they're outside of the scope of the FDA, the main regulator in the US. So they have a kind of a higher bar to meet the classification of a medical device. So those are just some of the differences, and it's not sort of unified throughout the world. And then I think that brings us on nicely to talk about another important point about how UK medical device regulation compares to EU medical device regulation, and what this means for the future and the potential changes when it comes to up classification of devices, which has been an area that you mentioned people have been concerned about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So just a bit of context, if we go back. So the UK is running on UK MDR 2002, medical device regulation 2002. So this goes all the way back to kind of 20 plus years ago, and it has not been updated since. Well, there's been some updates, but fundamentally it's the same. So it's very old. A lot of the writing doesn't really apply to software. It's been kind of adapted or interpreted for the use of software. But like we said, it applies to primarily hardware and medical devices. Whereas in the EU, they are on what's called EU MDR, which was fully adopted in 2021.
Right.
And the reason we are not aligned at the moment is because of Brexit. So Brexit happened at around about the time of EU adoption of the new MDR, and we didn't retain it as in the EU retained law. So we are on our old MDR. And the kind of ironic thing is we actually wrote the majority, apparently, and this is what I've been told, we wrote the majority of the new MDR because, of course, we were very aligned with the EU and we are experts in our own way in medical devices. Yeah. So we actually wrote the majority of the new law, which is based on recommendations from what's called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So we're on a very old version, and there's been a newer version in the EU, which we haven't adopted yet.
So we're on 2002.
Yes, exactly.
So just getting to grips with email back then, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And what this practically means is, this is why a lot of software as a medical device in the UK can fall under class 1 and not be externally audited, because those definitions aren't really there. The EU has added bits to kind of up classify those software as a medical device use cases. So yeah, a lot of software can legitimately fall into class 1 at the moment, but the MHRA recognizes that this is a bit disproportionate, and probably a lot of software that is currently UK class 1 should really be 2A or above, aligned with the EU.
Yeah.
And what that means is there's a move to align with the EU and update the regulation. And I mean, the talk of this happening as early as next year. I don't know what the timelines are, and I suspect these things take a long time. It was I think it was 2023 when they published the kind of that they were looking at doing this. So watch this space. But the move is that we will align more closely with EU MDR, and that our risk classification of software as a medical device will change, and likely class 1 devices, as they are now in the UK, will be upregulated to class 2A.
So it might feel like we are tightening our regulation, but what we're actually doing is bringing ourselves into line with the EU, with the regulations that they're using, which we largely help write.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, good. That sounds like a very positive change, actually.
I think it's positive. Something needs to be done, because the difference between a class 1 device and a class 2A device is very vast. You have a huge number of class 1 devices which go pretty much unchecked because they're not externally audited, whereas a lot of them are probably involved in kind of diagnosis processes and things like that, which is not great. We need to do something about that. And on the flip side, class 2A is a pretty rigorous process of audit, evidence generation, quality management, all of this, which is for early stage companies quite a high bar to meet. So I think there needs to be some middle ground, and I have some ideas about how we can improve that. But ultimately, I think a lot of class 1 do need to be upregulated to 2A. And then just feeding back to the LLM point, I feel like the kind of those clinical administrative AI scribe tools, which may or may not meet the definition of a medical device, they are expected to be class 1 in the UK now, it seems. In the EU, not so clear. Some suppliers have registered as a class 1 device in the EU because they were already registered in the UK, but by necessity. So I suspect that those that aren't suggesting diagnoses might just continue to be a class 1 device, because you can still be a class 1 software as a medical device in the EU. They just have a lower threshold to enter that class 2A definition, and they have some written exceptions about what could be a class 1 device. But that's my own feeling, but we'll see. If as soon as a device is suggesting a diagnosis, or then they would meet the definition of 2A or above.
I can see why designers, engineers, developers, and maybe clinicians even are anxious about the potential changes. But do you feel from a patient point of view, it will actually help build trust?
Yes, I think one of the reasons this has been highlighted is because of a lot of the concerns about kind of the fast pace of change and adoption of AI. And it's really come to the fore about the need for them to be safe, secure, effective, and all of these things. I do think there needs to be some reform in the regulation in terms of how to appropriately regulate these new tools, and instead of kind of bolting on bits onto quite old regulation, which is often what we've been doing. But I think, yes, ultimately, tools that use AI in clinical settings need to meet a specific bar when it comes to safety, efficacy, and security. All of these things are very, very important. I think there are some moves to, especially from the MHRA, to kind of streamline this process a bit. So at the moment, there's generally quite a high bar to get your classification. You're, say, certified as a 2A device or above, and then you have to do what's called post-market surveillance. And there's the MHRA recently changed some of the rules to basically make post-market surveillance higher quality. So enhancing what's required for reporting serious incident data to the MHRA and things like that, which I think is a good move. And then the MHRA is undergoing a bit of reform at the moment because there's a new CEO, and there's generally a bit of a move potentially to improve post-market surveillance, which would be great because I think with digital technologies, AI, monitoring those and seeing how they're doing is incredibly important, whilst also maybe lowering the barrier to entry slightly so that companies can meet the definition, but then they're held to a high bar when managing and monitoring safety after deployment.
So again, kind of that balance between patient safety and trust and quality, while not stifling innovation and kind of preventing progress before it's even started.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important for innovators to think about these things because, of course, becoming certified is a really important step if you want to be a medical device used in medical settings. But the processes involved are all generally useful processes. So they shouldn't necessarily be seen as, I have to do this just to become certified. They ultimately are processes around quality management. So making sure you're producing quality product or service. That's relevant to any company, whether they're a medical device or not. Risk management, again, very important thing to do. Your clinical evaluation, that's very important. It's often what people struggle with because doing a clinical study is a lot of time and resource. But if done well, it can be hugely impactful because say you get your device certification, that often people think that's the hardest part, but then the hardest part is, okay, now we're a device. How do we sell ourselves to the likes of the NHS? And what they're going to want to see is good evidence in the form of clinical effectiveness, maybe, and cost effectiveness. So if you've already done robust clinical studies that show you're very effective, maybe even cost effective, all of these kind of things, then those are things you're going to need after you've gained your medical device certification. So the things that you need to do are generally, good practice anyway. So I think,
and will set you up well then especially if you're looking to sell into the NHS.
For sure. So I think not seeing it as a tick box sort of annoying thing to do is definitely advisable, and doing it properly will pay dividends down the line for sure.
That's excellent. Yeah, that's an excellent way of looking at it. It definitely sounds more like software is becoming thought of more like drugs are, medicines. So when all of this already applies to medicines, and it's basically just holding software to those same standards.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's advantages and disadvantages to doing that. So the MHRA is the regulator primarily for medicines, and they also, as a result, regulate medical devices. It's the same in the US with the FDA. And that because there are similarities. Like you say, a medication might treat something, or a diagnostic test might diagnose something. With the software, again, software might diagnose something or treat something. So having that same bar of kind of safety and efficacy is important, but I think it's not so simple to kind of apply everything in the kind of pharmaceutical sector to software as a medical device. I think we have to recognize some of the differences, especially when it comes to newer technologies like LLMs using to transcribe patient records. That's very much not what a medicine kind of does. So when they diverge more from diagnosis and treatment to other applications, I think you have to consider different things. And that also feeds into how you generate evidence for them as well. So evidence generation, you can't simply do an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, like you would do with a drug, depending on the use case. You might have to have a different approach.
Yeah.
And then this actually feeds into some of the more recent, well, actually, there's mainly been one large language model, at least one high profile large language model that's been certified as a class 2A or above device. There's one called Valmed, which has been classified as a 2B device in the EU. And what they do, just for context, is they're a clinical decision support tool. So a clinician can use AI for clinical queries of a kind of curated knowledge base and get diagnosis and treatment suggestions. And that's a class 2B device because it's really driving clinical management in potentially high risk settings. And I think the reason I bring that up is firstly to highlight an example of an LLM which has been classified as a medical device, which is very new. And also they had to do quite a novel clinical evaluation in order to get acceptable sort of evidence of the efficacy and the safety. They couldn't just say do an RCT because there's no sort of equivalent of so that's just, you have to come up with new ways to demonstrate these things, and this is going to be a whole new area. And this feeds into how do we evaluate LLMs more generally. People have been developing frameworks, but it's because they're so new, you have to develop.
There's no precedent.
There's no precedent. You generally have to compare to kind of a standard of human performance. And, but yeah, it's a very, very interesting area. But I think we'll see more of that in the future about how do you evaluate these tools.
So here's the question. One of the key post-market activities that the MHRA does in terms of medicines is adverse event monitoring. If you've got software that you've developed and it's classed as a medical device, is there an element of adverse event reporting involved in that?
Yeah, so exactly. Very good question. So we have what's called the yellow card scheme in the UK, which is, again, originally designed for medication. So if you get an adverse reaction to a medication, you would report it formally to the MHRA, and it would appear as like a yellow card warning, like if you look up that medication of these potential reactions. So now that's expanded to software as a medical device. So medical device user manufacturers are expected to report these adverse events using the same scheme to the MHRA. So these devices should be registered with the MHRA. So these adverse incidents can be logged against that particular device, that software as a medical device. And this is I think there was guidance, I can't remember if it was from the MHRA or NHS England, but to encourage the users of ambient scribe tools to report adverse incidents, maybe like significant hallucinations, this as adverse incidents via the yellow card scheme. So that's all I think ultimately we do need to have robust requirements and for this kind of post-market surveillance, post-deployment monitoring, so you can really log these incidents. And ultimately, we kind of want to get to that almost real-time monitoring of these tools of performance and safety. And I think that's some of the advantages of digital tools compared to medicines. I mean, all of these things are online. You should be able to have an automated reporting system almost. And I think that's exciting. So and there have been moves from the MHRA to increase the requirements for post-market surveillance. So I think we want to get to a world where you can monitor these tools and get much better evaluation and ongoing monitoring data, really, which I think is that's the direction of travel, which is promising, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree. Again, just sort of building trust, improving quality. None of that can be bad things.
So I think
if I'm currently working on a chatbot that I intend to deploy in a healthcare setting, what would your advice to me be?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends very much on the specific use case, the intended use. Assuming you're a medical device, working out what risk classification. If you are currently meeting the definition of a class 1 device in the UK, I would start preparing appropriate kind of documentation for class 2A or above. I mean, as a simple starting point, you should put together your quality management system, which is essentially a system of policies and procedures to make sure you're producing quality and safe product. And then this is actually a requirement for class 1, but because no one checked it, the quality is quite poor. But for class 2A, you do have to have an auditor assess your quality management system. And that is an organizational wide system. So it's something you can start to put together now, which will be important in the future. It's not medical device specific. There are ISO standards for quality management for non-medical devices, which are never absolutely mandated, but some products and services do it as to show a sign of quality and that we're doing things properly. So it's good practice as well as being a requirement for.
Yeah, absolutely. Device. I guess the key question is when does that have to start? So should I be implementing those kind of systems during the whole ideation process?
No, I would say work out what you're building. So get all the data, do some early testing, craft your initial MVP and intended use. And then once that's reasonably well defined and that you're like, this is what we're going to build and this is we're going to do a study on and these kind of things, then I think that's the point when you'd be like, okay, now we should put everything in place to make sure we were doing it properly. But I think in the early phase, there's so much change and so dynamic.
Yeah.
I think once you're set on this is what we're going to build, of course, you still might change things. But I think in the very early stage, when you're iterating, ideating, things could change after talking to different people. I would say, yeah, have a good idea of what you're building first and then look at the other parts.
Okay.
I think just to summarize, for everyone's benefit, I think definitely work out what you're building, what's intended use is, whether you're a medical device or not. Then work out your risk classification. Be aware of recent guidance when it comes to large language models, particularly with AI scribes. I'd highlight the MHRA's digital mental health technology guidance, which was published earlier this year. And then also be aware of the moves for UK MDR to align with EU MDR and the potential for existing class 1 devices in the UK to be classified to class 2A as early as next year, although I suspect it will take longer.
Yeah, amazing. I feel like we've covered a huge amount of information while at the same time barely scratching the surface.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul. This has been really useful and super interesting.
Thanks, Karen. No, it's been great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the Leap podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and sign up to our mailing list to find out more.